Hello everyone, I'm Creepy Raindrops, and I'm here to assist you today. I know many of you use this video to unwind and fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Get cozy, relax, and let yourself drift into calm. The Man in the Mirror's Reflection. New Year's Eve 2025 was cold and rainy in Seattle, Washington. The drizzle painted the streets in streaks of shimmering light as fireworks reflected faintly in puddles. Samantha Sam Hill, a 32-year-old graphic designer, had planned a quiet night at home. Her apartment, nestled on the 7th floor of an old Art Deco building in Capitol Hill, was cozy, warm lighting, a couch piled with soft blankets, and a single candle burning on the coffee table. It was 11:17 p.m. when Sam first noticed something strange. She had been scrolling through her phone, half watching the New Year's Eve coverage on TV, when she glanced up at the tall mirror hanging across the room. It was a beautiful vintage mirror she'd found at an estate sale earlier that year. Its silver frame tarnished but elegant, with intricate floral patterns etched along the edges. At first, she thought it was just her tired eyes playing tricks. The rain pattering against the window behind her made the room feel a bit surreal, and the flicker of the candlelight added to the effect. But then she saw it again. In the reflection, her figure was there, sitting on the couch as it should be. But her reflection's hand, its left hand, was tapping against the armrest. Sam froze. She looked down at her own hand. It wasn't moving. A chill crept up her spine. She tried to laugh it off. Too many ghost stories, she muttered to herself, forcing a nervous chuckle. She set her phone down and walked toward the mirror, inspecting it closely. Her reflection mimicked her movements now, perfectly in sync. "See? Nothing weird," she said aloud, as much to convince herself as to fill the eerie silence. The clock on her wall ticked loudly. 11:23 p.m. Sam decided she'd had enough of the mirror. She threw a blanket over it, covering the reflective surface. "There," she said, stepping back. But as she returned to the couch, a faint noise stopped her in her tracks. A light tapping sound, almost like fingers drumming on glass. Her eyes darted toward the covered mirror. "Rain," she whispered. "It's just the rain." But the tapping grew louder, sharper, more insistent, and it was coming from inside the mirror. By 11:30 p.m., Sam's unease had turned into outright fear. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. "Okay," she muttered, her voice shaky. "I'm just gonna take it down. Sell it tomorrow." With trembling hands, she pulled the blanket away. Her reflection wasn't there. The figure in the mirror was a man now, a tall, gaunt man in an old-fashioned black suit. His hollow eyes stared directly at her, his lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. Then he raised a hand and tapped on the inside of the glass. The clock struck 11:45 p.m. Samantha stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The man in the mirror didn't break eye contact. His movements were fluid yet unnatural, like a puppet on strings. His pale hand pressed flat against the glass as though testing its boundaries. "Nope, nope, nope," she muttered, panic overtaking her senses. Grabbing her phone from the couch, she opened her contacts list. Who could she call? Her best friend. Rachel? The police? Would they even believe her? As she fumbled with the screen, the lights in her apartment flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out entirely, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the faint blue glow of her phone and the occasional burst of fireworks outside. "Come on, come on," Sam whispered as she hit Rachel's number. The dial tone rang out, each second feeling like an eternity. Then Rachel picked up. "Sam? Happy New Year's Eve. What's... Rachel? Sam interrupted, her voice trembling. Something's wrong. There's a man in my mirror. He's not me, he's just there. What? Are you okay? Did you drink too much? Rachel's voice was concerned but skeptical. I'm serious, Sam hissed. He's in the mirror, and... A loud crash echoed from the living room, cutting her off. She turned slowly, her heart thundering in her chest. The mirror had fallen from the wall, the ornate frame lying shattered on the floor. The glass, however, was still intact. But now, the reflection showed something impossible. Her living room, but empty. No couch, no candle, no Samantha. Just the man. Sam? Sam? Are you there? Rachel's voice was faint through the phone. Sam didn't answer. She took a step closer to the broken mirror, her curiosity warring with fear. The man in the reflection was no longer looking at her. Instead, he was facing away, walking deeper into the mirrored version of her apartment. Where are you going? She whispered aloud, as if he could hear her. As though in response, the man stopped. Slowly, he turned his head over his shoulder and smiled again, wider this time. Then he spoke. You're late, he said. His voice a guttural whisper that seemed to echo in the darkened apartment. The clock on the wall struck 11:55 p.m. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Samantha's legs felt rooted to the floor, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The man's voice wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a vibration deep in her chest that made her want to scream and run. Yet she couldn't move. Her phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the hardwood floor. Rachel's voice faintly called out, Sam? Sam, are you okay? But Samantha couldn't tear her gaze away from the mirror. The man began walking again, his steps deliberate and measured. In the reflection, he moved toward the far end of the mirrored version of her apartment. But something was off. The space in the reflection didn't seem to end where her real apartment did. The man stepped into a dark hallway that didn't exist in reality, its walls narrowing and stretching into an impossibly deep void. 11:57 p.m. The ticking of her wall clock seemed louder now, filling the silence. Samantha's fear turned to desperation. She forced herself to move, stumbling to her knees to grab her phone. Rachel, she cried, pressing it to her ear. Sam, what's going on? You're scaring me. I don't know what's happening. The mirror. It's showing things that aren't real. There's a man and he's leaving, but not really. What do you mean, leaving? Rachel's voice was trembling now. Samantha glanced at the mirror again. The man had stopped at the edge of the hallway and turned to face her. He raised a hand, his long fingers curling into a beckoning motion. No, she whispered, shaking her head. He beckoned again, more insistently this time. I think he wants me to follow him, Samantha said, her voice cracking. Don't you dare, Rachel shouted. Get out of there. Leave the apartment right now. Samantha's breathing grew rapid. The urge to run was overwhelming, but she couldn't ignore the pull of the man's gaze. His presence was magnetic, like he was reaching into her mind and drawing her closer. 11:59 p.m. The apartment around her felt less tangible, the walls fading into shadows at the edges of her vision. The reflection was all she could see clearly now. The man's lips moved again, forming one final word before midnight. Now, the clock struck midnight. The clock's chime echoed through the apartment, loud and resonant, drowning out the distant fireworks. Samantha flinched, her grip on the phone tightening, though Rachel's voice had been replaced by static. In the mirror, the man stepped back into the dark hallway, disappearing into the shadows. But the reflection didn't go dark. Instead, The mirror began to ripple, the glass shimmering like disturbed water. Samantha's reflection returned, but it wasn't her. The figure wore the same sweater and jeans, but her expression was unnaturally serene, her eyes empty and unblinking. The reflected Samantha tilted her head, as if studying the real one. Then she smiled. "Sam." The voice wasn't Rachel's anymore. It was her own, distorted and echoing. Samantha dropped the phone in shock. "No, no, no, no. This isn't happening." Her reflection leaned closer to the glass, its smile widening unnaturally. "You don't belong there anymore," it said softly, its voice dripping with malice. "Come where you're meant to be." The surface of the mirror cracked suddenly, splintering outward from the center like a spiderweb. Yet the figure in the reflection remained undisturbed, the fractures not affecting it at all. Samantha stumbled backward as the room seemed to tilt. The air grew cold, so cold her breath came out in visible puffs. The shadows along the walls deepened, twisting unnaturally. The mirror began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that resonated in her bones. Her reflection reached out, pressing its hand against the fractured glass. A faint glow pulsed beneath its palm. Then, the cracks in the mirror began to spread into the air itself, as if reality was shattering. The edges of the room started to distort, bending and folding inward like paper being crumpled. Samantha screamed, falling to her knees. She looked away from the mirror, trying to ground herself. She pressed her palms against the cold floor, but it didn't feel solid anymore. It felt wrong, like she was sinking into something soft and unsteady. "Don't fight it," the voice whispered, now coming from everywhere and nowhere. With one final, deafening crack, the glass of the mirror shattered completely. But instead of falling, the shards hovered in the air, glowing faintly. The reflection stepped through them, emerging into the apartment. It stood there, fully formed, its hollow eyes locking onto Samantha. It raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "Your turn," it said, its voice perfectly calm. The reflection, no, the thing, moved closer. Its footsteps made no sound as it crossed the floor, yet every step sent an icy chill through Samantha's body. She scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the wall, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Stay away," she shouted, though her voice cracked with fear. The figure tilted its head, its empty eyes narrowing. "You don't understand," it said, the same distorted version of her voice. "You've been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Samantha cried, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it knelt, reaching out a hand toward her. Its fingers were pale, elongated, and too smooth, like porcelain. "Come with me," it said softly. "It's better on the other side." Samantha's instincts screamed at her to run, but her body refused to move. It was as if the figure's presence sapped all her strength. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest. Behind the figure, the shattered mirror fragments began to move, swirling in the air like a vortex. Beyond the fragments, Samantha could see a distorted version of her apartment, darker, colder, and endlessly vast. Shadows writhed within, forming shapes that were almost human but wrong. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not going anywhere with you." The figure's smile faltered. Its hollow eyes flickered with something that might have been irritation or hunger. "You don't have a choice," it said, its voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. Suddenly, the swirling fragments of the mirror shot toward Samantha, surrounding her in a cage of glowing shards. The room around her dissolved entirely, replaced by the dark void she had glimpsed in the mirror. The floor beneath her vanished, and she found herself suspended in nothingness. The figure stood before her, now larger, towering over her like a shadow made flesh. Its smile widened, revealing rows of impossibly sharp teeth. "This is where you belong," it said, its voice echoing endlessly in the void. "Your world doesn't want you anymore." Samantha clenched her fists, her fear giving way to anger. "You're lying," she shouted. "You're not taking me anywhere." The figure laughed, a sound that echoed like shattering glass. "Fight all you want. Midnight has already passed." In the distance, Samantha heard faint, distorted echoes of the fireworks she'd once been so eager to see. They sounded like screams now, as if the world she knew was slipping away. And then, she felt a pull, a cold, unrelenting force dragging her toward the figure and the dark world beyond. Samantha gritted her teeth, the icy pull growing stronger with every passing second. Her mind raced, searching for something, anything that could anchor her to the world she knew. She thought of her family, her friends, the little things that made her life hers. The coffee shop she loved, the smell of rain in Seattle, the way her cat, Luna, would curl up on her lap. "No," she whispered, her voice growing steadier. "I don't belong to you." The figure's smile faltered, its hollow eyes narrowing. The pull intensified, but so did Samantha's resolve. She clawed at the air, forcing herself to stand against the weightless void. Her surroundings wavered, the dark world flickering like a faulty signal. The figure stepped closer, its towering form blocking out what little light remained. "You can't fight me," it hissed, its voice reverberating with a cruel certainty. "Your time is over." "No!" Samantha shouted, her voice echoing through the emptiness. Summoning every ounce of willpower, she reached out, not toward the figure, but toward the glowing shards of the mirror that still floated in the air around her. The fragments pulsed with an unnatural light, but they felt familiar, like remnants of the reality she belonged to. As her fingers brushed against one of the shards, a searing pain shot through her hand. She cried out but didn't let go. Instead, she gripped the shard tighter, feeling its jagged edges cut into her skin. The light intensified, spreading through her like a shockwave. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like static. "No!" it screamed, its voice losing its calm composure. "You can't." But Samantha didn't stop. She reached for another shard, then another, pulling them toward her. The light grew brighter, piercing through the darkness. With every shard she touched, the pull of the void weakened. "You're not real," Samantha yelled, her voice breaking through the cacophony. "You're just a reflection, a twisted version of what you think I am. But I'm me." The figure let out an ear-splitting roar, its body dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows. The void around her began to crack, splinters of light breaking through like rays of sunshine after a storm. With one final push, Samantha thrust the shards together. The light exploded outward, consuming everything in its path. When Samantha opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. The mirror lay shattered on the floor, its frame cracked and dull. The room was silent except for the faint popping of distant fireworks outside. She sat up slowly, her head pounding and her hands trembling. Her phone buzzed beside her, and she picked it up with shaking fingers. Rachel was still on the line. "Sam? Oh my God. Are you okay? What happened?" Samantha took a deep breath, glancing at the broken mirror. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "but it's over. I think I'm safe now." Outside, the clock struck 12:01 a.m. A new year had begun. But as Samantha turned away, a faint, ghostly whisper echoed from the shards of the mirror. Samantha froze, the whisper sending a cold shiver down her spine. She slowly turned back toward the shattered mirror. The shards lay still on the floor, their jagged edges catching the faint glow of the city lights outside. Everything looked normal, ordinary, even, but the whisper lingered in her mind, like the faint echo of a song she couldn't forget. Rachel's voice broke through the silence. "Sam? You're scaring me." "What do you mean, safe? What's going on over there?" I don't know," Samantha said softly, her voice trembling. "The mirror. It broke. But I thought I heard something just now." Rachel's concern deepened. "Sam, get out of the apartment. Come stay with me tonight. Please, whatever's happening there, it's not safe." Samantha hesitated, glancing around the room. The air felt heavier, as if the atmosphere hadn't yet settled after whatever had just occurred. The apartment felt wrong, like a place she no longer recognized. "Yeah," she finally agreed. "You're right. I'll grab a few things and head over." As she stood, her eyes fell once more on the broken mirror. Something about it held her attention. The shards seemed to shimmer faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though they were still alive with the energy of what had just happened. She told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she wasn't convinced. Samantha grabbed a bag and stuffed it with essentials: a sweater, her wallet, and her phone charger. She glanced at Luna's bed in the corner, but the cat was nowhere to be seen. "Luna," she called, her voice tinged with worry. A faint rustling came from the bedroom. Samantha sighed with relief and walked toward the sound. "Come on, girl. We're leaving." She stepped into the room and froze. Luna sat on the windowsill, staring intently at the reflection of the city lights in the glass. Her fur was puffed up, and her tail flicked back and forth in agitation. "Luna?" Samantha whispered, stepping closer. The cat turned to look at her, but something was wrong. Her usually bright green eyes were dull and glassy, and her movements felt stiff, unnatural. Luna opened her mouth as if to meow, but no sound came out. Instead, Samantha heard the whisper again. The reflection in the window flickered. For a split second, Samantha saw something else. Another room, darker, with shadowy figures moving in the corners. And there, standing in the center of the reflection, was him, the man in the suit. His hollow eyes stared directly at her, and his mouth curled into a smile. He raised a single finger to his lips in a shushing gesture. The whisper came again, louder this time. The clock's hands spun backward, its ticking growing louder, as though time itself was unraveling. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, her breaths shallow and ragged. The world around her seemed to stretch and distort as the man's presence grew stronger, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Luna, her once beloved cat, now walked toward her in jerky, unnatural movements. Her fur stood on end, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. The air itself felt heavy, suffocating, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. "No," Samantha whispered, backing away. "You can't have her." But the man's smile only grew wider, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's already too late," he said softly. "You crossed into my world when you touched the mirror, and now you'll never truly leave. Not unless you give up everything." "Everything?" Samantha's voice cracked. "I won't give you anything." The man's smile faded, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something cold, something more sinister, in his gaze. "You already have. You just don't realize it yet." Suddenly, the room around her seemed to warp. The walls stretched and bent, warping into unfamiliar shapes. The windows flickered, showing fleeting images of a dark, twisted world. Outside, fireworks had turned into bursts of sharp, jagged light, flashing like angry signals from a place far beyond the normal world. Samantha stumbled backward, clutching her head as the sound of ticking grew deafening, until it felt like the whole universe was collapsing inward. The man moved closer, his tall, thin frame casting a long shadow across the floor. Luna stopped in front of her, her glowing eyes fixed on Samantha, unblinking. The man extended a hand toward her. His fingers were long, cold, and unsettlingly smooth, like they belonged to something not quite human. "Come," he whispered. "You're mine now, and there's nowhere left to run." Samantha felt the cold chill seep into her bones as his hand drew nearer. Her body tensed, resisting the pull, but it was as if the very air around her was working against her will. The whisper grew louder, now a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. "You're mine." She looked around frantically, searching for an escape. But the door was gone, and the windows were nothing but warped reflections of another world. Panic surged through her, and for a moment, she thought she might lose herself entirely. Then, her gaze locked onto something in the far corner of the room. An old, cracked photo frame she hadn't noticed before. In the frame, a picture of her family sat, the image slightly distorted, but still recognizable. Her mother's smile, her father's hand resting gently on her shoulder, and beside her, the one person who had always kept her grounded, her little brother, Max. "Max," she whispered. The whispering voices in her head fell silent for a brief moment. The man's hand froze in midair. Samantha's mind raced. No, I won't give in. I won't become part of this world, She snatched the photo from its frame, holding it in front of her like a shield. "You can't have me," she said, more firmly this time. "You can't have any of us." The man's expression faltered for the briefest of seconds. His eyes narrowed, and his mouth twisted into a snarl. "You still think you can fight this? You think the past can save you?" The air grew colder still, and the warped shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, reaching out toward her. But Samantha stood tall, holding onto the photo, refusing to let go. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Tell me." The man's smile returned, though it was colder, sharper now. "I want what you've already given me," he said, his voice soft and insidious. "But I'll take a little more before you leave." The ground beneath her shifted. The light flickered, and the man's image began to distort, becoming more like the shadows that surrounded them. And then the temperature plummeted. Samantha gasped as she felt something icy and sharp tighten around her chest, a sensation like being smothered in cold hands. The man's laughter echoed in her ears, but there was no warmth, no humor in it. "I'll keep you here," he whispered, "in this place between places. You'll never escape." But as the shadows drew closer, Samantha felt a surge of strength she didn't know she had. Holding the photo tightly, she whispered a single word. Samantha's hand tightened around the photo, and with a surge of energy, she pushed it forward, as though using it to cast off the oppressive darkness that had begun to envelop her. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The whispering, the cold, the shifting shadows. The man's figure flickered, his monstrous form wavering like a reflection on water. His hollow eyes met hers, but there was something unfamiliar in his gaze, a flicker of uncertainty, as though he hadn't anticipated this resistance. Then, with a loud, bone-shaking crack, the floor beneath her feet split open. The dark void beneath her yawned wide, threatening to swallow her whole. But Samantha didn't flinch. She planted her feet firmly on the ground and held the photo high. "No," she repeated, louder now. "I won't be trapped. I won't be part of this." The man's face twisted with rage, his figure contorting as though he was being pulled apart from the inside. "You're a fool," he hissed. You can't escape. You've already opened the door. This is where you belong now." But Samantha didn't back down. She could feel the cold fingers of the shadows clawing at her, trying to drag her into the abyss, but the warmth of the photo, the memories of her family, of everything she loved, gave her strength. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the photo, blinding her for a moment. The man screeched, his form disintegrating into smoke as the light intensified, pulling everything around her in. The swirling shadows began to unravel, and the room seemed to fracture in slow motion, like a mirror being shattered. Samantha felt herself falling, but this time, she wasn't falling into darkness. The light surrounded her, pulling her upwards, away from the abyss. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding as she was swept through the fractured world. Then, as quickly as it began, everything stopped. The oppressive cold lifted, the shadows vanished, and she felt solid ground beneath her feet once more. When Samantha opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. The broken mirror was gone, the shards scattered across the floor, but the air was calm now, peaceful, as if the storm had finally passed. The fireworks outside were nothing more than distant flashes, no longer the sharp, jagged bursts they had been before. Luna, who had been eerily silent, sat by her feet, looking up at her with bright, normal eyes. Samantha took a deep breath, still trembling, but feeling lighter than she had in what felt like forever. She looked around the apartment. It was normal. The distortion had been washed away. The clock on the wall read 12:03 a.m. Her phone buzzed again, and she picked it up, her fingers still shaking. "Sam?" Rachel's voice crackled through the line. "What happened? Are you okay?" Samantha smiled, a shaky but genuine smile. "I'm okay," she said softly. I think it's over." For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on her chest lifted. The fear, the darkness, the endless whispers, all gone. The man was gone. But even as she settled back into the reality she once knew, a small part of her couldn't forget the whispers. And as she glanced over her shoulder, toward the corner where the shattered mirror had once been, she saw something in the reflection. A shadow standing just outside her apartment door. Her heart skipped a beat, but this time she didn't flinch. She wasn't alone anymore. She wouldn't be fooled again. Samantha stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at the shadow in the reflection. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there, no mistaking it. Her eyes narrowed, and she took a slow step toward the door, her every sense alert. The air in the room was still, but something felt off. The silence was almost too perfect, too deep. She felt a creeping sensation crawl up her spine, the same eerie feeling she'd experienced earlier, when she had first faced the man in the mirror. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, breaking the silence. She hesitated, glancing down at the screen. It was Rachel. Samantha's fingers hovered over the phone, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. Something was wrong. The shadow, she thought, is not gone. Taking a deep breath, Samantha turned away from the door, heading toward the window instead. She needed to think, to ground herself, but as she reached the sill and gazed out at the distant skyline, her reflection caught her eye. First, she thought it was just the lights playing tricks. The shadow in the mirror had been a trick of the mind, hadn't it? But then the reflection in the window moved. It wasn't her. It was the figure, the man. His silhouette stood behind her, his hollow eyes glistening in the window's reflection, a smirk twisting across his face. Before she could react, his voice echoed, smooth and chilling. "You still think you can escape, Samantha?" Samantha spun around, but the apartment was empty. She was alone. Asterisk, she had to be star. The air felt heavier now, the walls closing in. She stepped back, panic rising in her throat. The clock on the wall ticked, but the hands weren't moving in normal time anymore. They twisted, spasmed backward like before. The room began to fade, like a dream slipping through her fingers. "Not yet," came the whisper again, closer now, as if it was inside her head. Her eyes darted to the door, the last possible way out. It was still open slightly, but there was something strange in the hallway beyond it. A presence, a shadow that seemed to stretch further than the darkness should allow. "Not again," she whispered, her voice shaking. But it was too late. The doorway, the threshold to the unknown, was pulling her in. The man's voice grew louder. The shadow in the window grew clearer, more defined. Samantha could hear him moving toward her, slow, deliberate steps. She could almost feel the cold of his touch even though he was nowhere near her. Midnight was only the beginning. "You belong here," he said, his voice low and relentless. "The doors I open don't close so easily." Samantha's body reacted on instinct. She backed up, her mind racing, thinking desperately. There had to be something, anything, to stop this. Suddenly, Luna let out a loud yowl from behind her, breaking the oppressive silence. Samantha turned to see her cat, but Luna was no longer herself. Her fur was matted and wild, her mouth wide open in a silent, unnatural scream. Her eyes were glowing again, but now they were full of something more, something sinister. Samantha felt the ground tremble beneath her feet as the apartment began to flicker and distort, like the static on an old TV screen. She was caught between two worlds now, the one she knew and the one that was pulling her deeper with every passing second. She ran toward the door, but as she crossed the threshold, a powerful force slammed against her chest, throwing her back into the apartment. She hit the floor hard, gasping for air, unable to breathe. She clawed at the ground, struggling to stand, but the air itself felt like it was pressing down on her. Luna's eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity now, and in the corner of the room, the shadows began to stretch once more, growing, twisting into monstrous shapes that seemed to pulse with life. The figure's voice was now a cacophony of whispers, filling her head, drowning out everything else. "You'll never escape," he said, his presence filling every corner of the room, suffocating her with his coldness. "Not as long as I am here." Samantha's pulse thundered in her ears, but deep down, something in her refused to give up. This wasn't her fate. Couldn't be. She wasn't just going to disappear into this place, this twisted reflection of her own reality. She wouldn't let the man take her. Samantha struggled to breathe, her chest tight as the suffocating presence of the man and the dark shadows pressed in from all sides. But amidst the swirling chaos, something inside her sparked, something fierce, something unyielding. She couldn't let it end like this. The whispers in her mind grew louder, but she focused. She focused on the photo she had held earlier, the image of her family, the memory of her mother's comforting smile, the sound of her father's reassuring voice, the warmth of her little brother's embrace. The love and connection she felt from those memories had kept her grounded before, and it was going to keep her grounded now. Samantha's hand shook as she grabbed the small pendant hanging from her neck, a gift from her mother. The cold metal felt like a lifeline, a tangible link to everything she fought for. She clutched it tightly and stood up with determination, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "I am not yours," she declared, her voice ringing out through the distorted space. "I choose my own path. You won't control me." The shadows seemed to pulse with anger, the distorted shapes writhing and tightening around her. The man's form loomed larger in the corner, his hollow eyes watching her with predatory intensity. He opened his mouth, and his voice came again, cold and mocking. You think a trinket can save you? You think your memories will protect you from me? His voice was a low growl, resonating with the dark power that filled the room. You have no idea how deep this world goes, Samantha. You've already crossed the threshold. You can't walk back now. But Samantha stood firm. I don't need to walk back. I'll walk forward, into my world. With those words, the pendant in her hand began to glow softly, a faint golden light seeping from it, growing brighter with every heartbeat. She could feel the power of her memories, her family, her home, her life, flowing into the pendant, strengthening her resolve. The man recoiled, his expression twisted with frustration. The air in the room began to crackle, the very walls vibrating as though reality itself was resisting her defiance. You can't defy me, he hissed, his form growing more insubstantial, like smoke twisting in a fierce wind. You're mine. You've always been mine. Samantha's heart beat faster, her grip on the pendant tightening as she held it in front of her like a shield. The light from it blazed with intensity, pushing back the shadows that surrounded her, pushing back the man who had haunted her. With one final, desperate scream, the man lunged toward her, his form a swirling mass of darkness. But the light from the pendant was too much. It exploded outward, a blinding wave of warmth and light that engulfed everything. The darkness recoiled, dissipating like smoke in the wind. The whispers fell silent. The shadows melted into nothing, and the oppressive weight that had gripped her chest lifted. Samantha blinked, the world suddenly still around her. She stood alone in the apartment, the broken shards of the mirror scattered across the floor. The clock on the wall was still, the hands frozen in place at 12:07 a.m. Luna sat at her feet, her eyes back to normal, calm and curious as ever. The oppressive cold had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence, one that felt final. Samantha glanced around the room, breathing heavily, but now the shadows were gone. The air felt lighter, and the once distorted space now seemed oddly peaceful. But as she sank to her knees, exhausted, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something had been left behind. The whisper, asterisk not yet asterisk, echoed faintly in her mind, but it was softer, distant. She wasn't sure if it was real or just a lingering afterthought, but Samantha knew one thing for certain. She had one. Samantha's breath slowed, but the unease didn't leave her. She rose to her feet, glancing at the door, then back at the remnants of the mirror that once held the man's dark, oppressive presence. The apartment was still and quiet, but something in the air felt different, almost like a faint hum of something just beyond her reach. She glanced at Luna, who had begun to groom herself with the same indifference as before. But there was something unsettling about how she kept glancing up at Samantha, her gaze unblinking, as if waiting for something. The clock on the wall ticked once more, its second hand moving normally, the minute hand creeping forward. But the sound seemed louder now, sharper. She looked at the clock again. The hands read 12:09 a.m. Could it be? Samantha muttered to herself. Did I really break free? Or is this some kind of delay? Her eyes darted back to the doorway. The shadows were gone, yes, but something in her gut told her that the man, asterisk whatever he was asterisk, hadn't been entirely defeated. She had broken the bond, the connection, but had she truly destroyed him? Or merely delayed him? Samantha shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. The fear, the cold, the oppressive whispers, they were gone. But there was no denying that she felt an unfamiliar weight on her chest, something heavy yet unseen. Had he left a piece of himself behind? With a deep breath, she walked toward the door, determined to leave the apartment. It felt wrong to stay here any longer, in the place where she'd faced that unimaginable darkness. As she reached the door, She hesitated, her hand on the knob. The apartment was silent, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, as though the world was holding its breath. The sound came from the other side of the door, loud and deliberate, as though someone was standing there, waiting. Her heart jumped, and she froze. The knock came again. 3 distinct raps. Samantha stepped back, her pulse quickening. Her first instinct was to run, to leave, but the fear, that deep primal fear that she hadn't felt since the darkness had first claimed her, held her in place. She turned to Luna, who was still sitting, watching her with those unervingly bright eyes. The cat's fur seemed to stand on end, her tail twitching uneasily. "Who's there?" Samantha demanded, her voice louder than she felt. There was no answer, just an eerie, almost oppressive silence that followed, hanging in the air like a weight. Samantha's hand gripped the knob again. She couldn't leave. She wouldn't let him have the last word. But she wasn't sure she could open the door. What if the man, or worse, something worse, was on the other side? Another knock, this time longer, louder, as though whoever or whatever was on the other side was growing impatient. Her breath came faster. The door seemed to pulse with energy, as though it too were alive, feeding off her fear. There was no escaping this. Not now. It was as though the door itself were another threshold, another barrier between the worlds. She had already crossed so many lines. Was this yet another one? Luna let out a low growl, her tail swishing, her body tense. The reflection of the room in the window behind Samantha flickered. A brief flash of something strange. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Samantha gasped, stepping back, her heart in her throat. But there was no figure standing there. No man, no shadow, just the cold, empty hallway, stretching out before her, dark and inviting in its emptiness. But the air was different now. The temperature had dropped, and the faint scent of something ancient, something stale, lingered in the hallway. A shiver ran down her spine as she peered into the darkness, her mind racing. Then, without warning, the light above her flickered and went out. The apartment plunged into darkness. Her breath hitched. The shadows in the hallway seemed to move. Then, a soft whisper echoed from behind her. "Samantha!" It wasn't the man's voice this time, but something else. Something familiar. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. It was the voice of her mother. "Asterisk, Mom?" "Asterisk," she gasped, spinning around to look at Luna. But the cat was gone. She was alone now, in the dark, with only the whisper and the faint, cold draft moving through the apartment. The voice came again, clearer now, more urgent. "Samantha, come with me." Samantha's legs felt weak, and her mind screamed at her to run. But something in the whisper, something in the pull of the darkness, compelled her to take a step forward. The door to the hallway was still wide open, and beyond it the shadows waited. Samantha stood at the edge of the doorframe, her body trembling, her mind at war. The voice, it sounded so much like her mother, but there was something off, something wrong. She couldn't explain it, but the whisper didn't carry the warmth and comfort she remembered. It was laced with something else, something dark, something cold. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, reaching toward her like hands, hungry, pulling at her very soul. "Don't go," her instinct screamed, but her feet felt heavy, as though she was being drawn into the darkness despite her every effort to resist. Another whisper, closer this time. "Samantha, please." Her mother's name on her lips felt like a rope being tied around her chest, pulling her into the unknown. Samantha hesitated, looking over her shoulder toward the safety of the apartment. But it felt like the walls were closing in, the air thick with pressure, as though she was caught in a vice. The hallway beyond the door stretched out endlessly, the darkness swallowing the light from the apartment behind her. "Don't listen to it," she whispered to herself, her breath ragged. "Don't fall for it." But the voice grew louder, and with it came a strange, magnetic pull. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a need to go toward it, to see, to know. She couldn't explain it. The rational part of her screamed for her to turn away, but the part of her that had been lost in the darkness before, the part of her that had felt that terrifying void, now yearned to fill the empty space with something, anything, familiar. Her hand, almost involuntarily, reached for the door. No, she told herself again. Don't do it. But as her fingers brushed the doorframe, she felt the weight of the whisper shift, as though it had moved, becoming more tangible, more real. "Please, Samantha, I need you." Her heart lurched, and the memories flooded back. Her mother's face, her gentle touch, her soft, soothing voice. The ache in her chest deepened. Was this really her mother? Was she calling to her? The dark hallway loomed ahead, and suddenly the air felt thinner, as though time itself was stretching, warping around her. A distant part of her mind screamed that this wasn't right, but everything in her being, every desperate instinct, wanted to believe. And so, with trembling hands, she stepped across the threshold. The moment her foot touched the hallway floor, the temperature dropped sharply. Her breath fogged in the air, and a cold, biting chill seeped into her skin. The hallway seemed to stretch impossibly farther, the walls dark and closing in. She could feel the shadows moving, slithering beneath her skin, and yet, there was no turning back. As she moved deeper into the hallway, the door to the apartment slammed shut behind her with a violent crash, the sound reverberating through her bones. She spun around, her heart racing, but the door had vanished. There was nothing but endless darkness behind her now. Her pulse quickened. The whisper was gone, replaced by the oppressive silence of the hallway. Where was the voice? She scanned the dark, her eyes darting left and right, looking for any sign of movement. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, asterisk movement star, a figure, tall and shrouded in shadows, standing at the far end of the hallway. His silhouette was unmistakable, the man. But this time, he wasn't just a shadow. His form was solid, his figure real and menacing. He was waiting for her, watching her, and then asterisk a familiar face star. Her mother, or what looked like her mother. Her skin was pale, her eyes empty and lifeless, but the smile was the same warmth, the same tenderness that Samantha had known her whole life. "Mom," Samantha choked, taking a hesitant step forward. The figure, her mother, tilted her head, smiling that same smile, but it was no longer warm. It was twisted, distorted, like a mask of something else. A mask of something far darker. "You came," the figure whispered. "I've waited for you." Samantha's blood ran cold as the truth slowly settled in. This wasn't her mother. It was the same thing that had haunted her, the same thing that had used her memories against her. The man, the thing behind the mirror. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure spoke, its voice now layered with an unrecognizable depth. It wasn't just her mother anymore. It was the thing that had been playing with her all along. "But now that you're here," the shadows in the hallway seemed to pulse with an insidious life, closing in on her from all sides. Her heart hammered in her chest as the figure began to move toward her, its face warping into something unrecognizable. Half her mother's, half something monstrous. The hallway around her began to twist and bend, the walls shifting as though the entire space was folding in on itself, reshaping into a new nightmare. The air grew thick, suffocating, the whispers of the man returning in waves, louder, more relentless. "No," Samantha whispered, stepping back, but the hallway wouldn't let her leave. It was closing in around her, trapping her in a nightmare with no escape. "Come, Samantha," the voice called again, sweet and venomous. "You're mine now." And with that, the darkness engulfed her, and the hallway swallowed her whole. Samantha's heart raced as the dark mass of shadows surged toward her, her body paralyzed by fear. Every instinct told her to run, but her legs refused to move. The twisted figure of her mother. No, the thing moved closer, its face warping further into something unrecognizable. The air around her thickened, suffocating her, and she could feel the walls pushing in, like they were about to crush her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes darting to every corner of the hallway, desperate for a way out. But the darkness pressed in on all sides, and the door she had passed through was gone, swallowed by the shifting walls. There was nowhere to go. The thing in front of her grinned wider, its teeth sharp and unnaturally white against the darkness. "You can't escape, Samantha. You've already made your choice." The voice, now not her mother's, but the deep, hollow one she had heard before, echoed in her mind. "You're mine." "No," she gasped, the word trembling in her throat. But even as she said it, she knew the truth. She had already crossed the threshold. She had already given in to the darkness. Asterisk, not yet. Not yet. There's still a way, asterisk. In that moment of desperation, a memory flashed in her mind. Something her mother had once told her when she was little. Asterisk, always look for the light, even in the darkest place. It's there, hidden, waiting to be found. Asterisk. The memory flickered, like a distant star in the overwhelming blackness. Samantha clung to it, reaching deep within herself. Asterisk, there has to be something. There has to be light, asterisk. The figure laughed, a cruel sound that reverberated off the walls. "There is no light here, Samantha. Only darkness. Only me." Her pulse thundered in her ears. But then, asterisk, a flicker star. A spark of light, small at first, but growing stronger. The pendant around her neck, the one that had once glowed when she fought the man, began to hum. Samantha's hand shot to her chest, her fingers clasping the pendant. The warmth from it spread through her, as though it were alive, pushing back the darkness, filling her with a surge of power she hadn't known she had. The figure faltered, its movements becoming more erratic. The walls trembled, as though they were unsure of what was happening. The light from the pendant grew brighter, illuminating the hallway, pushing the shadows back, making them writhe in agony. "You can't," the thing hissed, but it was too late. The light from the pendant blazed with an intensity that lit up the entire space. The walls cracked, the floor trembled beneath her feet. The hallway began to unravel. Samantha clutched the pendant tighter, calling on every ounce of strength she had left. She wasn't going to let it end like this. Not after everything she had been through. Not after the man had taken so much from her. "Begone," she whispered, her voice shaking with both fear and determination. The light exploded outward, shattering the darkness around her. The walls disintegrated. The twisted, shadowy figure of her mother screamed and dissolved into nothingness. The oppressive weight of the shadows lifted, replaced by a blinding white light. The air grew warmer again, lighter. Samantha stood alone in the emptiness, the hallway gone, the apartment no longer a prison. The pendant, still warm in her hands, had dimmed, but it was still there, its light faint but steady. The door to the apartment, asterisk her apartment asterisk, reappeared in front of her. She felt no hesitation this time, no fear. She knew what she had to do. With a final, lingering glance at the space behind her, she stepped forward, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The door opened, and the apartment was once again normal, peaceful. Luna was sitting at her feet, her eyes calm and steady. Samantha sank onto the couch, exhaustion flooding her as the adrenaline faded. She was safe. She had made it through. But a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. She had faced the man, confronted the shadows, and found a way to escape them. But the memory of the whisper, asterisk not yet asterisk, still echoed in her mind. And as she looked out the window at the city below, the thought gnawed at her. What if this was just the beginning? Samantha sat in the silence of her apartment, the weight of everything she had just experienced pressing down on her. Luna, curled up beside her, purred softly, grounding her in the present moment. The apartment felt peaceful again, the oppressive chill and the suffocating shadows gone. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passing of time, as though nothing had ever happened. But deep within her, a quiet unease lingered. The light from the pendant had dimmed, but it still sat on her chest, a constant reminder of what she had survived. She knew, without a doubt, that she had come close to losing everything, that she had crossed into a place where the boundaries of reality and nightmare no longer held. And though she was free now, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her back. Something had been left behind. The whisper, that chilling voice that had followed her through the darkness, still echoed faintly in her mind. Not yet. Samantha shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as though trying to hold the remnants of her fear at bay. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the truth. The darkness hadn't been defeated. It had only retreated, waiting, watching for a new opportunity. Her mother's voice, the figure in the hallway, the shadows that had bent and twisted around her. None of it had been a coincidence. The man, the force that had haunted her, was part of something much larger, something older. And she had been touched by it, changed by it. But for now, the battle was over. The apartment was quiet. The city outside was calm. Samantha allowed herself a deep breath, the first she had taken in days, and looked down at Luna, who was now snuggled close, content in the stillness. The fight had taken everything out of her, but in the end she had won. For tonight, that would be enough. She closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to rest, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, casting soft rays across the room. And somewhere, just beyond the edges of her awareness, the shadows waited. The end.